So there is the free press of Africa is in jeopardy because all of the parasite nations, the neo-colonialist nations, are coming into Africa, building relationships with Africa's major television stations, Africa's major websites, and Africa's major newspaper printers to make sure they don't print anything that is unfavorable to the neo-colonialist agenda. So if China continues to invest as heavily as she has into African media, African people will be ignorant and uneducated as to what the Chinese are up to, because you won't have any press that can accurately report on how China is making incursions into Africa. When we look at what China is doing in Africa right now, and let us be absolutely clear, brothers and sisters, China is in Africa to exploit. China is in Africa because China sees Africa as being a major part of its future empire. Chinese are not in love with Black people. If you don't believe me, go to China. I've been there many times. Chinese do not treat African people with respect. So why are they in such a rush to invest in Africa? The Chinese are in such a rush to invest in Africa because they are interested in putting African nations into long-term loan debt to Beijing, so that the African countries will have no choice but to concede land, to concede water, to concede resources. In other words, when the Chinese invest in Africa, they're really investing in themselves, because if they give an African country money to build schools, if they give an African country money to build a sports stadium, if they give an African country money to build hospitals or to renew themselves, when the African country defaults on the Chinese loan, that institution that was built with the Chinese money will now become the property of China. So China is not investing in Africa for the sake of Africa. China is investing into Africa for the sake of China. Are we still there, family? I just went blank.
Yes, we're still on.
Okay,
please
my brother. So when you switch off, we still there. No problem. I got you.
Yeah,
I wasn't sure. We're good to go. If you need to switch off, you can do that. So far, China has invested $72 billion. China has invested $72 billion into Africa since 2014. 14 years, $72 billion. Last week, they promised an additional $50 billion investment into Africa. Why are the Chinese so thirsty about investing in Africa? Number one, China is overpopulated, and China is looking to relocate and displace her Chinese citizens into Africa. Number one. Number two, China is the world's largest producer of cheap goods. And because China is the world's largest producer of cheap goods, what better place to sell your surplus?
You may proceed, please.
Hold on. Can you see me, my brother? And it's for the sake of time. Okay. So China has invested $72 billion in Africa since 2014. China is currently Africa's largest beneficiary of loans. Africa owes the white man, the power structure, in particular the IMF, $42 billion. So you're looking at $72 billion to China. China just promised another 50, and then you have $42 billion to the International Monetary Fund. Right now, Africa's debt to gross domestic product ratio is 68%. What that means is 68% of everything Africa makes, all of the revenue on the continent, 68% of that. And some countries are under that, some countries are over that. But 68% of everything that the mother continent produces as of right now is owed out to debt. That is a big problem, because that means that we are only 32 percentage points away from Africa owing everything that she generates financially and otherwise to these vampires, to these parasites, be it Chinese parasites, East Indian parasites, Russian parasites, British, French, Belgian parasites, or American parasites. And we need to be very clear about something. The reason it's so difficult for Africa to improve herself isn't just because of corrupt government. Every government on the planet Earth is corrupt. The American government is corrupt. The British government is corrupt. The Chinese government is corrupt. Every government is corrupt. No government on earth functions under righteousness. The reason Africa is having such a difficult time, I hear someone speaking. The reason Africa is having such a difficult time is because of the structural adjustment programs that are imposed on Africa from the World Bank, the IMF, Britain, France, and Belgium. Three of the major structural adjustment programs that they impose on Africa. Number one, you must have a free market economy. What that means is no African country that accepts loans from the World Bank, none of them are allowed to protect any of its domestic markets. So if I live in a country that produces tea, I don't want anyone else coming into my country to sell tea because I'm going to protect my country's tea market to make sure our economy survives. But America is going to tell that African country, you cannot protect your tea company. So that means that if Starbucks wants to sell tea, if Lipton wants to sell tea, if Tetley wants to sell tea, you have to let these parasitical corporations come into your country and compete with your own homegrown domestic tea market. And that is why so many African economies are being sabotaged. This is why Africa is actually importing products that Africa can make. Africa is importing products that Africa can grow because they don't want Africa to become an independent power. And so they force these governments to accept competition from other countries, even though these other countries will never accept competition from African commodities and products. That's number one. Number two is the interest rate. The rate that they charge Africa for these loans is so expensive, so ridiculous, so unacceptable that you'll be paying these loans off for the next 100 years. They do that on purpose to keep Africa into debt. And then the third thing that they require in exchange for these loans to the African continent is these family planning strategies and recommendations. And this is one of the reasons why Pan-Africanists in America, such as myself, we are not supporters of either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, but Kamala Harris does have a unique problem that she poses to Africa because she, like Joe Biden and Barack Obama before them, they are very serious about forcing Africa to accept this transgender identity, as well as this homosexual marriage situation. Now, we love all African people. We wish harm against nobody. But at the same time, we reserve the right to disagree with any lifestyle that threatens the best interest in cultural survival and spiritual integrity of the African continent. Moving on, a couple things that Africa needs to do. Number one, Africa needs to reclaim its media. Africa needs to reclaim its media.
Sorry, my leader, may I interject? There's someone with an iPhone. Can you kindly please mute? Or the host, can you mute the iPhone, please? So that we don't interrupt the speaker. The host, can you please interrupt the person with the iPhone 13 Pro Max? Thank you. Sorry, my leader, over to you. Sorry about that. Please proceed.
You've muted the speaker.
Oh, he was the speaker.
That was his phone.
It was your phone. Okay, so someone, please unmute the speaker. But there is a background music sound. I don't know if it's from him.
There is another iPhone making a noise. Dr. Umar. Hold
Okay.
Test, 1, 2, 1, 2, test.
Yeah, it's working. Okay.
We hear you.
All right. Okay.
Okay. So one of the things that Africa must do continent-wide, perhaps the African Union can play a role in this, Africa has to reclaim her media. Over the past 10 to 20 years, the Chinese government, as well as the Americans, the British, the French, the Belgians, the Russians, and others, they have been investing in African media, and they have been subsidizing African media. They are doing this heavily. So there is the free press of Africa is in jeopardy because all of the parasite nations, the neo-colonialist nations are coming into Africa, building relationships with Africa's major television stations, Africa's major websites, and Africa's major newspaper printers to make sure they don't print anything that is unfavorable to the neo-colonialist agenda. So if China continues to invest as heavily as she has into African media, African people will be ignorant and uneducated as to what the Chinese are up to because you won't have any press that can accurately report on how China is making incursions into Africa with terms of land, resources, and other things. It's the same thing with the French, the same thing with the British, the same thing with the Portuguese, the same thing with the Americans. Africa's free press is in jeopardy because it is accepting too much money from the Chinese. And the last time I checked, the Chinese now have the largest foreign media system in Africa. The Chinese are all over Africa paying off media platforms to report favorably upon Chinese neocolonialist initiatives. Next up, education is a big issue in Africa. The median age in Africa is 19 years old. That is a good thing. 19 years old is the median age in Africa. That means that nearly half of Africa are young people. That means promise. That means posterity. That means we have the opportunity to educate and organize and Pan-Africanize the consciousness of the future leaders of America, the future leaders of the African continent and the diaspora. However, in order to do that, we have to make sure that all of our children on the African continent and throughout the diaspora are receiving effective educational services. As of right now, there's 61 million children in Africa, 61 million of our babies in the mother continent who will never receive an education. That is a problem. I believe children have a human right, an African right, and a divine right to receive an education. We have to build education in Africa, and not an education just so Africans can run away to America, but an education that tells African children to stay home in Africa and make Africa great again. On top of that, the brain drain is a big issue in Africa. We have too many Africans, intelligent Africans, who are being wooed away to Britain, wooed away to Paris, wooed away to Washington, D.C., to use their talents to benefit the neocolonialist regimes of the former slave masters. We have to do something against the African brain drain. Also, we have to get back to a United States of Africa. The African Union is okay, but the African Union is not the original dream of Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. It is not the original dream of the most honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey. They proposed a United States of Africa. The problem with the African Union is most of the member states are in debt. Let me say that again. Most of the member states are in debt to foreign interests. So a lot of the decisions that are made at the African Union are not made in the benefit of African people. They're being made in the benefit of the neo-colonizers. On top of that, we have to deal with the fact that the new African Union headquarters was built to a tune of 200 million US by the Chinese. What greater contradiction? And I discussed this last spring in Addis Ababa when I was invited by the Ethiopian government to keynote their African Liberation Program. I expressed disappointment over the fact that we allowed a neo-colonialist puppet or neo-colonialist power in China to come into Ethiopia, come into Africa, and build the African Union. Nothing is worse than having a neo-colonialist build the headquarters for African governments. I'm quite sure that they put all kinds of listening devices throughout that African Union. We should be building it ourselves. On top of that, we have to look at the fact that the Chinese are loaning too much money that they know African countries cannot pay back. And the reason African countries are so quick, to jump onto these Chinese loans is because the Chinese don't have as many restrictions as the European parasites for African countries to access the loans. Chinese will give you more money and Chinese have less restrictions. But what African countries are not paying attention to is that the Chinese interest rate is also higher than the World Bank and the IMF. And let us put this in perspective. Although Africa owes $72 billion to China in debt, and although China is promising another $50 million of investment, and by the way, investment is the new word for neocolonialism. Investment is the new word for neocolonialism. But what we have to put in perspective is although China is America's leading investor, neocolonialist, what Africa owes China is only 1/3 of what Africa owes to the Caucasian parasite. So I want to make sure we understand that although China is leading in debt, leading investor in America, in Africa, Africa still owes more to the white man than what she owes to the yellow man. Peace and Pan-Africanism. I just had to shout out my UK family. This is King Kong.
I'm at the Legacy Center in Birmingham, UK, and I didn't even know that I was in the Legacy Center. Do you feel me? You got Garvey, you got Douglas, and you got the Prince of Pan-Africanism. I didn't even know I was up here like this. Now, to my USA Africans, my American Africans, I don't think I'm hanging up like this in none of our museums and centers. You feel me? So y'all better get with it before I move to the UK and get me a Birmingham queen and a London queen, extra thick in the thighs, all right? So get y'all act together. I'm here with my ancestors, Douglas and Garvey, and I just want to shout out the artists. You know what I mean? He got the history here and everything. I'm going to have him come to the school and do a big version of this, but shout out to Birmingham. Thank you to everybody who came out tonight. Nothing but love. We're going to do London tomorrow. See y'all at the Goldsmith University. And then we're going to see you at Manchester Sunday at the West Indian Community Center, Manchester, the first time in 10 years since the 70th anniversary of the Manchester Conference back in 2015. It's all love.